Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Rochlow and my project is on workplace violence policy and threat assessment program guidelines for the civil process industry in Alberta. In order to give you an idea of the type of working environment that civil process workers face on a day-to-day basis, I'm going to walk you through a number of different scenarios. Scenario 1. Process server is required to serve Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta documents at a Sturgeon County property. Open source threat assessment comes back negative for any threats. 3 pit bull dogs at the property on each attempt, and after multiple visits to the property, the process server learns that the defendant was a straw buyer, used to obtain firearms for organized crime, and was recently arrested. Scenario 2. Process server is serving Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta documents on a person charged with threatening a school shooting. Open source threat assessment was used to measure the threat. However, the RCMP refused to attend to keep the peace while the person is being served. The process server attends the property alone and unarmed. Scenario 3. The process server is serving a ban notice from all Alberta courthouses while unarmed to a potentially violent freeman or sovereign citizen who has threatened a Crown prosecutor. The Alberta Counterterrorism Crisis Management Team has issued a counterterrorism alert on this person, and the RCMP follow up with an arrest using ERT. Scenario number 4 is a bailiff serving residential tenancy court documents on a tenant in Okotoks. The tenant opens fire on the bailiff and the property manager accompanying him, missing both of them. The RCMP follow up with an arrest using ERT. What is the civil process industry? Civil process is an industry that includes workers who are employed in the execution and service of civil process. Civil enforcement bailiffs are workers who are employed to enforce the Civil Enforcement Act, and process servers are workers who are employed to serve court documents in civil actions, including residential tenancy disputes. Landlords and property managers involved in residential tenancy dispute matters. These workers execute civil process in accordance with the Residential Tenancies Act. SSIA licensed security and investigators who work for a property manager or landlord providing government licensed security or investigative services. The National Occupation Code, NOC, for bailiffs, sheriffs, and process servers is 4421. It is an occupational classification with barriers to entry, including work experience related to law enforcement, as well as knowledge of relevant statutes and laws, and a college diploma or bachelor's degree in legal studies is usually required. In 2021, there were 73 civil enforcement bailiffs appointed in the province compared to 7,906 police officers. It is far more likely for a resident of Alberta to be employed as a police officer than in the civil process industry. Statement of the problem. There has been an increase in workplace violence incidents involving workers in the civil process industry in Alberta. Although workplace violence-related legislation is in place, there are no guidelines or informational online dashboards for workers in the industry. Research questions. The primary null hypothesis is there is no current provincial or federal workplace violence legislation suitable for civil process workers in Alberta that can be used to develop guidelines, training, or informatics to ensure a safe work environment. The secondary null hypothesis is workplace violence in the civil process industry is a police matter, and the police are well equipped to provide immediate protection anywhere in the province, no matter how remote, for a civil process worker who is facing a threat of grievous bodily harm or death while in the workplace. Scope. There are no aggregate sources of data for incidents relating to process servers or workers in the residential tenancy subsectors. The Government of Alberta has only been compiling data on civil enforcement bailiffs who have exposure to all aspects of civil process, including residential tenancies. There has been a significant increase in incidents of workplace violence trends involving bailiffs in the province of Alberta from 2019 to 2022, including incidents of forcible confinement and the RCMP refusing to attend to keep the peace. There's been a significant increase in residential tenancy-related incidents from 2019 to 2022. There's been a significant increase in weapons-related incidents involving bailiffs from 2019 to 2022 as well. Weapons used include edged weapons, firearms, impact weapons of opportunity, and vehicles capable of causing grievous bodily harm or death. There has also been a significant increase in incidents involving injury sustained by a bailiff from 2019 to 2022. Total workplace violence incidents saw a 77% increase in 2022 versus the 3-year average. In 2022, the rate of violent incidents per bailiff increased 82% compared to the 3-year average. In 2022, the residential tenancy-related incidents increased by 111% versus the 3-year average, and the rate of residential tenancy incidents per bailiff increased 64% compared to the previous 3-year average. In 2022, there was a 60% increase in weapons incidents versus the 3-year average, and the rate of weapons-related incidents per bailiff increased 57% compared to the previous 3-year average. There is a caveat here. The research included incidents involving impact weapons of opportunity and vehicles which were not entered into the data set as weapons incidents. These types of weapons incidents can result in grievous bodily harm and death and should be entered in as a weapons incident to ensure accurate reporting. In 2022, bailiff workplace violence injuries increased by 48% versus the previous 3-year average, and the rate of injury per bailiff increased 49% compared to the previous 3-year average. Current applicable legislation pertaining to civil process workers in Alberta includes federal legislation. The Criminal Code of Canada defines bailiffs and persons employed for the execution and service of civil process as peace officers and public officers while in the course of their duties. This legislation ensures that peace officers and public officers are permitted to carry and use a firearm while in the execution of their duties in order to protect themselves from grievous bodily harm or death while in the workplace. Provincial legislation includes the Occupational Health and Safety Code, which requires that all employers provide a personal transmitter or panic button and workplace violence training for all workers in industries where there is a threat of workplace violence. Workers' Compensation Act and regulations require all employers to ensure that they have WCB insurance in place when they employ either employees or subcontractors, with the exception of subcontractors who are corporations. The subcontracted corporation must have their own WCB coverage in place. The Civil Enforcement Act and regulations regulates the civil enforcement subsector of the civil process industry. Security Services and Investigators Act and regulations regulates the licensed private security industry in Alberta. Although civil process is not one of the defined activities for licensees, they may be employed to assist in providing security in residential tenancy-related matters, like providing physical security for property managers or bailiffs engaged in civil process. This legislation allows for the carrying of a firearm in circumstances where there's a threat of grievous bodily harm or death from other people while the SSIE licensee is in the course of their duties. It also governs the approved use of force training, which covers collapsible batons, handcuffing, and weapons retention training for SSIE licensees, including SSIE licensed businesses. Civil process has never been associated with policing. It has always been a separate function in the administration of civil justice, and workers are protected by both robust provincial and federal legislation vis-a-vis occupational health and safety measures enacted to ensure their safety on the job. It is not realistically or tactically feasible to expect that police act as a placeholder for well-established legislative protections for workers in the civil process industry in order to protect them from grievous bodily harm or death in the workplace. The primary and secondary null hypotheses are rejected. Training, policy, law enforcement, and workplace culture solutions can help develop training guidelines for civil enforcement bailiffs, process servers, and SSIE licensees involved in civil process who face a risk of grievous bodily harm or death in the workplace with PPE or personal protective equipment proportionate to the level of risk. They can ensure that the culture of complacency or willful blindness to the threat of workplace violence in the civil process industry is rectified. And they can help implement evidence-based threat assessment guidelines for the civil process industry based on industry best practices. An online dashboard should be developed for Alberta Residential Landlord Association members so that they can report residential tenancy workplace violence incidents. This can help enable the industry to quantify the scope and seriousness of the problem in an easily accessible and understandable format. I hope you found this research interesting and informative, and that concludes my presentation.